Welcome back to the New York Times Close-Up. Joining us now, my former New York Times colleague, former Chicago Bureau Chief Isabel Wilkerson. She won the Pulitzer Prize for feature writing for the Times in 1994, as well as a host of other prestigious awards. Her first book, The Warmth of Other Suns, the epic story of America's Great Migration, has just been published by Random House. David Oshinsky, writing in the Sunday Times Book Review, described Isabel's approach to the subject based on more than 1,000 interviews written in broad, imaginative strokes. This book is something of an anomaly in today's shrinking world of nonfiction publishing, a narrative epic rigorous enough to impress all but the crankiest of scholars, yet so immensely readable as to land the author a future place on Oprah's couch. One of the things Chip McGrath said in the New York Times is that this is a magisterial new history of the black migration. Janet Maslin called it mesmerizing. It was almost a 15-year project, as you described it. You began when you were the Times bureau chief. You finished in Atlanta, where you moved in 2001. And you said, I needed to look through the exile's heart and feel that distant, rejecting, hurtful feeling and see what they left. When you saw that, what did you see? What kind of perspective did it give you on this great migration and why people left the South?
Well, I first started the research in the North, so that's where I found all the people who ultimately became the protagonists in this book, and that's where I interviewed over the 1,200 people. I stopped counting, actually, after 1,200 people in New York, in Chicago, in Milwaukee, in Oakland, in Los Angeles. That's where I started, and I really needed to be in the South to understand what was it exactly that they left. I needed to see actually how beautiful the land was, which made me feel even more empathy, more of an understanding of how hard it must have been to leave the only place they'd ever known for a place they'd never seen. That was really, in many respects, these anonymous big cities that could be forbidding to someone who was from a small town and from a rural area in the South. I needed to be able to see the land that they left, the people that they might have left. I talked with people who had stayed. So I had a chance to sort of feel and see and almost live to some degree on the land that they had left, and that gave me a better perspective on what it was that they'd left.
Much like immigrants from other countries, some of them made the choice to leave, some of them were pushed, some of them were desperate. But one of the premises of the book is that this was a self-selected group of strivers, people who picked up and went to take a chance to make lives better for themselves. Did that dream work for the most part? The epigraph in the beginning of the book is from Richard Wright and describes what other sons are. Why don't you read that?
Yeah, I will read that. I think it refers to almost any immigrant group, any immigrant who leaves the only place they've ever known for some place with no guarantee of a future, but with hope and acting on that hope. And it reads, I was leaving the South to fling myself into the unknown. I was taking a part of the South to transplant in alien soil, to see if it could grow differently, if it could drink of new and cool rains, bend in strange winds, respond to the warmth of other suns, and perhaps to bloom.
You were the daughter of migrants, if you will, two migrants who came to Washington, D.C., where you were raised. Was the dream fulfilled for so many people who came from the South to northern cities, particularly in the Northeast, New York, Harlem, Newark, and the Midwest, Chicago in particular?
Well, in order to answer that question, I often look at what was it they were seeking? What were they leaving and what were they looking for? What they were leaving was essentially a caste system, which was known as Jim Crow. The migration went from 1915 until 1970, when some of the essential reasons for their departures were no longer in existence, meaning Jim Crow ended. They were leaving a place where it was actually against the law for a black person and a white person to play checkers in Birmingham. Something as basic as that. Someone took the time to write that down. Every aspect of their lives was limited, restricted, and determined by the laws of Jim Crow. Every aspect, the kinds of work that they could do, the things that the schools that they went to, every aspect of their lives were determined by this arcane, feudal caste system, which was really unsustainable. And in many respects, the only thing that some people could do was to leave. Some of them, there's something about the immigrant heart that propels some people to leave and others not. And there's something about these people, 6 million African Americans left the South during this period of time. There's something about them that made them different in some ways from those who stayed.
You tell the story through three main characters. As someone said, this is a very Steinbeckian treatment, almost novelistic, except that it's all true. What did the winners have in common, the ones who came and succeeded, and why do we have, as you describe it, a generation of lost grandchildren of the migration?
Well, again, in some ways, it's about what were they seeking. They were not seeking to become necessarily CEOs of Fortune 500 companies or owners of skyscrapers. They essentially were looking to live out the American dream, which they weren't permitted to do in the South where they had been born. And so what I found, what I hope the readers come to their own conclusions about, would be that their success, however you define it, was based upon, did they achieve what they set out to achieve when they left? So for some of them, for example, the case of Dr. Robert Joseph Pershing Foster, who was a surgeon who had worked in the Army, had served his country in the Army, got out of the Army, and found out that he could not practice surgery in his own hometown of Monroe, Louisiana. So he sets out on this perilous journey, unexpectedly perilous journey from Monroe, Louisiana to California to pursue his dream. Well, it turns out that it actually was much more difficult for him to make a go of it there because he ran into stratification, a class system in Los Angeles, which meant that people who were there already looked down upon the people who were the new arrivals, which is so humanly
Which is true
story.
of almost every immigrant group we've ever seen. One of the things in writing this book is that you say it transformed you from a journalist into an unintended historian. What is the difference in skills and craft?
That's an interesting question. The thing that I discovered, well, I started by, interviewing as many people as I could to understand what the story was, the larger story was, finding certain themes and similarities among many of them. And then it turned out that over time, as the people began to die off, because in some ways this book was written with a great deal of urgency because these were people who were running out of time to tell the stories of the people. It turned out that I ended up having to rely a great deal on archival research, more than I had anticipated, because when people would pass on, that meant that the only way to find their stories were to go to those who might have been survivors or to find corroborating evidence in the archives itself, so that the work went from interviewing primarily to archival research, and that's where the historian came in.
This is an incredible book that has received stunningly good reviews. Isabel Wilkerson, formerly the New York Times, The Warmth of Other Suns, the epic story of America's Great Migration, just been published by Random House and reviewed in the Sunday Times Book Review. When we return, our interview with the